Coming up on this bonus episode of the All Aboard podcast, Phil tells more stories about being a rail fan in Boston. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Hey everybody, this is Phil Bell, PB Crisp, Enterprise B, Mr. 645, your highly trained rail enthusiast. Listen, I wanted to do a little bonus episode with you. I had so much fun talking about my time being a rail enthusiast in Boston, so I said, hey, why don't we just do a little bit more and talk about some of the other fun things that I managed to leave out during yesterday's broadcast. So, the first thing I wanted to talk about is when I went to Boston to actually start college. So that was back in May of 1999, and I went for orientation because, hey, look, it's a new city, it's a new school, everything is changing. So my aunt and I, we got on train number 172, which at the time was combined with 472, which provided the local service on the Springfield line between New Haven and Springfield. Now, for a very long time, these trains would be combined and separated at the New Haven station, with the primary train heading up to Boston going on the shoreline behind an F40PH, while also an F40PH would take a short section, the rear section, of the train up the Springfield line, which Amtrak then as now owns. And this was very important because at the time, remember, Amtrak did not have, there was no commuter rail service as there is today. So that meant that Amtrak's trains going up to Springfield were critical to ensuring that, there was some kind of service once you got north of New Haven on the way to Springfield. And so we got to actually see the separating of the train that took place there. And then because this was the period when a lot of work was being done to electrify the shoreline all the way to Boston, they actually ran our train over the inland route. So we departed ahead of the 472 and ran without stopping up to Springfield. And then we turned right, which is pulled on to what was now the CSX Berkshire subdivision, formerly the Conrail Boston line, and proceeded eastbound. So that was an interesting time because, number one, I was, of course, expecting to ride on the shoreline, which I had done before, so I'd never seen the inland route, and seeing the very large Springfield station, which only has a small number of tracks now, and that is even after the commuter trains began to operate on the line. So this station really is a relic, a throwback to a time when far more people would travel by train than do today. And at that time, it was still not in, I guess you could say, the much better condition that it currently is now that Amtrak and the states have done some level of rehabilitation on that, and also extended service up the Conn River line north of Springfield. At the time, that didn't exist. So we go in, we don't stop at Springfield, we continue on and roll along the Boston and Albany, getting to see a lot of the locations such as the Worcester Union Station, which has been lovingly restored. It is an absolute cathedral of rail transportation. You definitely want to see it if you get up to Massachusetts, going through Framingham, which is an important junction location then as now, not only because you have the trains coming up from, freight trains that are coming up from the Attleboro area and then ultimately going on to the Cape Cod region, but also the Fitchburg subdivision, which now no longer goes to Fitchburg, but goes north and serves a variety of customers up there. This area has taken on increased importance because now both Worcester and Framingham are part of CSX's operations that now extend into northern New England with their 2022 acquisition of Pan Am Railways, formerly the Guilford Rail System. The two interesting parts of that trip: number one, we got there early. How often do you hear about any transportation enterprise getting you there early? But we were early for about 15 minutes. So after departing Back Bay Station, we had to sit in the interlocking outside of South Station until they could clear a track that would be available for us to go in and actually get to a platform. The second part that was interesting is as we were sitting on that interlocking, I did not know this at the time, but the J.F. White and Perini, who were the contractors that were doing the big dig, which included the Ted Williams Tunnel that goes under the interlocking in South Station, had to find a way to keep the trains from collapsing into the new tunnel they were building. So they actually froze the ground. And they used this complicated system, and I believe it was carbon dioxide or somehow, and I can't remember exactly the particulars of it, but they froze the ground, and you could actually see as you were traveling through, a lot of the piping and so forth that went into the ground to keep it cold and cold enough that it wouldn't collapse. So for all those years before the Big Dig actually opened up, most Bostonians didn't know this, but you were actually traveling over a very hollow area that was frozen and kept in place. But they did a great job. It was strong enough, and there were never any problems until about a decade later, 2011, when there was a sinkhole that opened up because the ground had finally started to thaw out, and this produced some problems they had not expected. Now, at the same time they were doing this, they were also electrifying the line, as I mentioned earlier, to allow Acela Express and what was then called Acela Regional, which were the regular regional trains like train number 172, which my aunt and I took going up to my orientation, to use all straight electric locomotives getting into Boston. So as they were doing this work underground, they were also doing this work above ground. But that played a role in how we left Boston, which was on train 177, which still informally carried the name the Senator. And the Senator, of course, goes back to the days of the New Haven and the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, those trains will go on the shoreline through Back Bay Station. The tracks are actually separated. Back Bay has tracks for the Boston and Albany, former New York Central, which are to the north, and then there are tracks for the New Haven, which are to the south, in addition to the Orange Line subway. So there is one section when, if you're coming up north or going south either way on the New Haven, you'll be able to see the Orange Line subway to the fireman's side of the train if you're proceeding north, engineer's side if you're proceeding south. And then eventually you'll be able to see the Boston and Albany tracks after you get beyond the platform area and start to head towards what's called CP Cove, which is where the ownership for Conrail and CSX began until the sales took place in 2009. Now, normally we'd go to Back Bay and then continue down the shoreline, but due to the construction, Amtrak was routing as many trains as possible away from Back Bay Station, and those who needed to get to that area, which is a very upscale, wealthy area of Boston, includes Copley Square and so on, they were encouraged to take Metro Transit, which in this case is the MBTA, the Orange Line subway, the Green Line subway to get there. And to a certain extent, you can also get there with the Red Line through Downtown Crossing, although that's a very short walk from South Station to Downtown Crossing. And most people live there don't do it. They simply just walk unless they're very, very loaded down with their luggage. So instead of going into Back Bay, we continued south down the Dorchester branch, which took us through Upham's Corner and a very interesting and lower income section of Boston. And I mention that because most of the people, when you refer to Dorchester, it's usually in derisive terms. And so most people don't realize that it in fact is home to a major heavy rail branch of railroading. Now, in the time since I've been there, the MBTA actually upgraded the Dorchester branch to add stops and improve the stations that were there, made them far more welcoming and so on. And I don't know about if you can say the same for the rest of the area, as it was still pretty desolate by 2003 and then by 2008 when I ended up leaving. But it was quite interesting to ride what the MBTA called the Fairmount line, because that was a totally different animal from almost anything else that they were offering at the time. But we took the Dorchester branch down, got on the main line at Reedville, and just continued our way down to New Haven, New York, and eventually Newark. So that was my first introduction as a student to Boston. The next thing was the Mattapan-Ashmont high-speed line. Now, I saw this, and, normally when I'm going somewhere, I'm the person who wants to look up and find all the information that I can on railroading before I go down to the area. Well, I didn't really do that when I went up to Boston, and so I was a little bit flying blind. And when I saw the MBTA railroad map, and it said at the end of the Red Line's Ashmont branch, and just to be clear here, the Red Line has two branches, so it's a single line from Alewife, which is on the north side of the Charles River to the west of Cambridge, single line going all the way down to JFK UMass. Now, it passes through several important parts of Boston, including, as we mentioned, the South Station area, Downtown Crossing, which is right in the center, a lot of shopping, a lot of very large office buildings, which of course are not as occupied as they used to be when everybody tended to work 5 days a week from offices. south of that, south of South Station, you get into the JFK UMass area. This is where not only is UMass Boston does exist, but also you have the library, the presidential library for President John F. Kennedy, hence the name of the station. That is where the trains split. So one is splits off to the east and follows the New York, New Haven, and Hartford right-of-way, originally the Old Colony lines, which gets you to Braintree, Massachusetts. And that is the line I would use to get to work when I worked at State Street Bank in North Quincy, or Quincy, depending on how you pronounce it. Then there was the Ashmont branch, which heads to the west, also following a New York, New Haven, and Hartford line, although over the years that has been very much rebuilt and is hard to see much, if any, of the right-of-way of what was originally there until you get to Ashmont. Now you get to Ashmont, you get off the train, and although the station's been rebuilt, it was quite a example of urban decay in those days. And you went upstairs and there was a trolley line. This was the Mattapan Ashmont high speed line. And oh, by the way, this wasn't operated with some kind of computer controlled 1990s, 2000 era light rail vehicles. No. This was operated with 1940s era wartime President's Conference Committee PCC streetcars. Now, I had heard all about PCCs. I had read all about PCCs. I had never experienced them. And I did not realize that PCCs were what was on the Mattapan Ashmont high speed line. And these cars were painted just as they had been for the MBTA in the 1970s into the 1980s, when they were replaced first by the Boeing LRVs and later by the Type 7s, permanently you could say by the Type 7s, and a small group was spirited off to the end of the red line where they were put on this surface streetcar line, which is electrified and is not changed for pantograph operation, so it is true trolley pole operation there. And it was free if you rode all the way from Ashmont to Mattapan. And getting on board, it felt like you were getting on board a bus from the 1940s or the 1950s. Everybody was sitting in these, you've got to be honest with you, fairly uncomfortable seats, but it was so classic, and the ride was terrific. First of all, this is one of the few places where you could see that this had actually been a traditional railroad right-of-way, especially when you went over the bridges. And the bridges were the reason why the PCCs were used, as opposed to something like the Type 7s or cast-off LRVs from the main Green Line system. Because while the bridges were heavy enough, or strong enough, to carry some of the steam locomotives that used to ply them back when the New Haven was operating this as a regular railroad, they were not strong enough to endure the constant pounding that would take place from a heavier light rail vehicle like a Kinky Chariot Type 7 or even the Breda Type 8s, which were considered to be brought down there, but never have been done even to this point. And so the MBTA, even to this day, has continued to rebuild the cars and has painted them actually back in an MTA, as in Charlie on the MTA type scheme, of orange with silver roofs. And I do apologize, we can't get you photos here. As always, our technical difficulties are back, and I think that's just kind of like a regular part of the show. But if you are visiting Boston and you are a rail enthusiast, please, as soon as you can, go to the Mattapan Ashmont high-speed line, ride the streetcars, the PCC streetcars, some of which are operating over concrete ties in some areas, because they have done a lot to upgrade this line as much as they possibly can. It is a true hidden gem, and it is amazing to me that this isn't discussed more in the Railfan press. So I hope you'll get out there and do that. And then the final piece that I wanted to talk about was just a little funny part that I picked up from one of my friends, and this goes back to Charlie on the MTA. Now, this song, the real title of it is MTA, and was popularized by the Kingston Trio. Now, it's about a fare increase, and this fare increase actually did happen when the MTA, which was the predecessor to the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, raised fares all over its system, and then they instituted exit fares in some places. So exit fare is something that's not very common almost anywhere, but it does happen once in a while, although I don't know any place right now where that's the case. And so the way that works is you get on the subway or streetcar and you pay your fare at the start and you ride. And then if you get to a station that requires an exit fare, you pay additionally to get out. Now, the MTA's fare increase was what we'd call an absolute cluster because the passengers didn't know what to expect, and they most certainly didn't know about the exit fare. So the song is actually about a mayoral candidate who opposed the fare increase, and it turned out it was a communist, so they had to change the names around so that the larger public would not realize it was being talked about a communist in a time when, of course, communism was totally verboten. So that's how you get the song, but that's what happens to Charlie. Charlie gets on the MTA. He doesn't know he needs to pay his exit fare, so he goes for a ride. And then when he gets there, he doesn't have that nickel. And by the way, in these times, a nickel fare or a dime fare, that was actually fairly expensive for transportation. We think nothing of paying $2, $3, $4, $5, whatever it is to get on a subway, depending on where you are. In the Washington, D.C. area, you can pay $5, $6, $7 because it will vary by the different times that you're traveling. But in these days, fares were fairly fixed and they were very low. And of course, a nickel or a dime, that meant a lot. Well, Charlie can't get off. So they tell him, hey, you got to stay on the train. Now, the funny part is in verse number 4, where it says Charlie's wife goes down to the Scully Square station every day at 2:15, and through the open window, she hands Charlie a sandwich as the train comes rumbling through. No, I'm not going to sing for you. I won't subject you to that. But my friend Melissa, who I went to college with, she's very quiet, but she was always very vocal about this part of the song because she said, you know why Charlie's wife never gives him the 5 cents he needs to get off the train? And I never thought about that. I said, yeah, actually, that makes sense. Why doesn't Charlie's wife just give him another nickel? Then he can get off the train and come home. She said it's because she doesn't want him to come home. And quite frankly, it's probably true. And then you also have to ask, if Charlie really wanted to come home, why didn't he just get off at a station that doesn't have exit fare? For what it's worth, you can go to the Scully Square station, which is now called Government Center, and some of the work that was done subsequent to my time in Boston has revealed some of the old station interior where you can see the word Scully Square. Now, the area surrounding, of course, is quite a bit different. It's not even really known as Scully Square anymore because there's a big, gigantic City Hall, 1970s era, brutalist type architecture monstrosity that's on top of it, and a big plaza that's there, which is used for outdoor events. I think I saw Hootie and the Blowfish there one time. But it is interesting to ride this and see some of these landmarks that go in. Now, the final thing about for this bonus episode I want to talk about comes from what I'm wearing right now. This is my New York Jets number 16 Vinny Testaverde jersey. What does that have to do with trains, Phil? Well, here you go. So 2011, I went up to visit some friends. This is one of the few times that I've been back since I lived in Boston full time. And that was during the Jets Patriots playoff game. And now as a Jets fan, I had worn this jersey all over the place. I got all these weird looks because nobody expected me to be wearing a Vinny Testaverde jersey. Most people at the time were wearing Chad Pennington jerseys, but this time, not only did the Jets get in the playoffs, but they beat the Patriots. And so after they beat the Patriots, I got on the train to come back to Northern Virginia, and I'm sitting there inside my Amtrak train, Shoreline, Northeast Direct, Regional, because the Acela Regional branding had been gone by then. And I notice that the Patriots football special, coming back with all the depressed fans of Tom Brady and all those other guys that had made life hell for Jet fans for so long, was arriving on the track next to us. So I just enjoyed every minute of watching all those angry, depressed, and irritated Patriot fans getting off of their train while I stood there and sat there, pointed and laughed. And of course, being a little bit of a chicken in that case, I was pointing and laughing because I knew if I went to the door of the car and decided to point and laugh, I probably would get beaten up and run over by a train. But I didn't want that to happen. So there you go. That was the last Railfan story I have for Boston. I do hope to get back up there this summer to do some actual Railfanning and taking some pictures. And when I do, we will have a separate episode on that so we can give you some of the present day locations where you can go and get some great shots and video of railroading in the area. And we will also be riding the Mattapan-Ashmont high-speed line and documenting that because at some point those PCC streetcars will no longer be operating. And so it is important to see one of America's last true rolling railroad museums. So we'll see you down the main line on Wednesday when we talk about regional railroads. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have a great day.